Welcome to this lecture on models. In this lesson, we will explore how models help us understand complex environmental systems that are often too large, too small, or too complicated to study directly. Models provide simplified representations of reality, allowing us to visualize relationships, predict future outcomes, and evaluate environmental problems. Throughout this topic, we will examine different types of models, their applications, strengths, and limitations. Let us begin by examining the learning objectives. By the end of the lesson, you should be able to define key concepts, including what environmental models are and why they are used to simplify complex systems. You should also explain different model types, such as conceptual, quantitative, and systems models. Next, you will apply models to real-world environmental issues, for example predicting the impacts of deforestation or climate change. An important skill is to analyze model use by identifying assumptions, strengths, and limitations. You should also be able to interpret information from model outputs, graphs, and diagrams, and finally evaluate implications, assessing how models support environmental management and sustainable decision-making. Together, these skills help us understand, analyze, apply, and evaluate environmental systems more effectively. A model is defined as a simplified representation of a system. We use models to explain how environmental systems work, predict future outcomes, and analyze interactions between components. For example, climate models help scientists forecast future temperature changes. Notice the difference between a real system and a model. A real ecosystem contains countless organisms and interactions, whereas a model focuses only on the most important relationships, such as plants, animals, and decomposers. Models can take many forms: physical models like a globe, conceptual models showing cause and effect relationships, mathematical models using equations, computer models simulating environmental processes, and graphical models displaying trends and patterns. A good model should be simple, relevant, accurate, useful, and testable. However, all models have limitations because they simplify reality and may omit important details. Therefore, model predictions depend on both the quality of the model and the data used. Let us now examine how models work in environmental systems. The process begins by observing the real system and collecting data. We then build a model using key variables and relationships. Next, the model is tested under different what-if scenarios to explore possible outcomes. This helps us identify patterns, cause and effect relationships, and system behavior. Once validated, the model can be used to predict future responses to change. For example, climate models simulate atmospheric processes to forecast future warming, population models predict population growth using birth and death rates, and predator-prey models explain interactions between species. An important feature of all models is that they are continuously refined as new data become available, improving their accuracy and usefulness for environmental decision-making. Forms of models. Models can be presented in several forms. A graph shows relationships between variables, such as population growth over time. A diagram illustrates components and interactions, for example a food web showing energy transfer between organisms. An equation describes relationships mathematically, such as the logistic growth model used to predict population size. A simulation uses computer software to imitate real-world processes, such as forecasting forest growth or climate change. Finally, words can also form a model by explaining environmental processes, for instance, describing how eutrophication occurs when nutrient enrichment leads to algal blooms and oxygen depletion. Different forms serve different purposes and audiences. Scientists may use equations and simulations for precision, while diagrams and written descriptions are often more accessible for communication and education. In practice, combining multiple forms of models provides a more complete understanding of environmental systems and improves our ability to explain, analyze, and predict environmental change. Importance of models in environmental systems. First, models help us predict climate change by simulating Earth's climate system. For example, climate models use temperature, atmospheric, and ocean data to forecast future warming, sea level rise, and the frequency of extreme weather events. This information supports mitigation and adaptation strategies. Second, models help manage natural resources such as water, forests, soil, and minerals. Resource managers use models to estimate future demand and ensure sustainable use. For instance, water resource models can determine how much water can be withdrawn from a river without causing shortages. Third, models help us study ecosystems by simulating interactions among producers, consumers, decomposers, and the abiotic environment. They allow us to predict the consequences of species loss and understand food web dynamics. For example, removing a top predator may trigger cascading effects throughout an ecosystem. Finally, models help us understand pollution spread in air, water, and soil. Air quality models predict how pollutants disperse under different wind and weather conditions, helping identify high-risk areas and plan control measures. Overall, models improve predictions, support evidence-based decision-making, save time and resources, protect environmental and human health, and contribute to sustainable environmental management. Limitations of models. Although models are valuable tools for understanding and predicting environmental systems, they are never perfect representations of reality. First, models oversimplify reality. Real-world systems contain countless interactions, but a model includes only the most important components. For example, a climate model cannot represent every cloud, plant, river, or human activity on Earth, so some details are inevitably excluded. Second, models depend on assumptions. A population growth model may assume constant birth and death rates, no migration, and unlimited resources. However, real populations are affected by disease outbreaks, migration, and resource shortages. If assumptions are unrealistic, predictions may be inaccurate. Third, models contain uncertainty because they rely on estimates and incomplete data. Weather forecasts, for instance, provide temperature ranges rather than exact values because atmospheric systems are highly complex and influenced by random events and measurement errors. Understanding these limitations helps us interpret model results critically, compare alternative models, and improve decision-making. For example, a flood model may fail to predict flooding if it does not account for extreme rainfall or blocked drainage systems. The key takeaway is that models are powerful but imperfect tools and they should be used wisely, with an awareness of their assumptions, uncertainties, and limitations. Now let us explore the types of models used in environmental systems. The first type is a physical model, which is a tangible three-dimensional replica. Examples include a globe or a volcano model. These help us visualize structures and understand how systems appear or function. Second are conceptual models, which use diagrams to show relationships between components. Food webs and water cycle diagrams are good examples because they illustrate interactions among system elements. Third, mathematical models use equations and numerical relationships. For instance, the logistic population growth equation predicts how populations change as they approach carrying capacity. Fourth, computer models use software to simulate complex environmental systems. Climate and weather forecasting models can test multiple scenarios and predict future conditions. Fifth, statistical models analyze data to identify patterns and relationships. For example, Regression analysis may reveal how temperature influences ice cream sales or how rainfall affects crop production. Finally, graphical models use maps, charts, and graphs to display information visually. Topographic maps, bar graphs, and flowcharts help identify trends and spatial patterns. Each type of model serves a different purpose, but together they help scientists understand systems, analyze relationships, make predictions, and support environmental decision-making. Physical models, which are three-dimensional, tangible representations of real objects, systems, or processes. Physical models help us visualize complex systems, understand structures, test ideas, and communicate scientific concepts more effectively. There are three main types. Scale models are smaller or larger versions of real objects, such as a bridge model used by engineers to study design and stability. Structural models show the arrangement of parts within a system. For example, a model of the human heart helps students understand chambers, valves, and blood flow. Mechanical models demonstrate movement and function, such as gears showing how energy is transferred within a machine. Physical models have several important characteristics. They are tangible and measurable, represent real-world systems, show structure and function, can be manipulated for testing, and support observation and explanation. Examples include a globe representing Earth's shape and locations, a volcano model illustrating eruption processes, a molecular model showing atomic bonds, a solar system model displaying planetary orbits, a wind turbine model demonstrating electricity generation, and a human skeleton model revealing bone structure. Hence, physical models bridge the gap between imagination and reality, making complex environmental systems easier to understand and investigate. Conceptual models are simple diagrams used to show relationships and connections within environmental systems. Conceptual models help us understand how different parts of a system interact without focusing on numerical calculations. A conceptual model simplifies reality by highlighting key components and their relationships. Common examples include food webs and water cycle diagrams. Consider a food web. Plants act as producers and transfer energy to primary consumers such as grasshoppers, caterpillars, and mice. These organisms are then consumed by higher trophic levels, including frogs, birds, snakes, and hawks. The arrows indicate the direction of energy flow, from the organism being eaten to the consumer. Such models help us predict how the removal of one species may affect the entire ecosystem. Another example is the water cycle model. Solar energy drives evaporation, water vapor condenses into clouds, and precipitation returns water to Earth's surface. Water then moves through runoff, infiltration, and collection before the cycle repeats. This model illustrates the movement of water between different environmental stores. Conceptual models are valuable because they help visualize complex systems, reveal relationships between components, improve communication, and support learning and environmental decision-making. Mathematical models use equations, calculations, and numerical relationships to represent and analyze real-world environmental systems. Mathematical models are particularly valuable because they allow scientists to make predictions and test different scenarios quantitatively. One important application is population growth modeling. The discrete growth model predicts population size from one time period to the next using a growth rate. For example, a population of 1,000 individuals growing at 5% per year increases to 1,050 after 1 year. A more realistic approach is the logistic growth model, shown here as. This model incorporates carrying capacity, K, the maximum population that the environment can sustainably support. As resources become limited, population growth slows and eventually stabilizes. Mathematical models are also widely used in climate science. Energy balance models simulate how incoming solar radiation, Earth's reflectivity, and heat loss influence global temperature. Scientists then use these relationships to generate climate projections under different greenhouse gas emission scenarios. Notice how higher emissions produce larger temperature increases over time. These mathematical models support wildlife management, conservation planning, climate forecasting, and resource allocation. Their strength lies in transforming complex environmental processes into measurable relationships that can be analyzed, compared, and used to guide environmental decision-making. Let us now examine computer models, which are digital simulations used to predict changes in complex environmental systems. Computer models combine data, algorithms, and computing power to imitate how real-world systems behave and respond to different conditions. Computer models follow a systematic process. First, scientists input data such as weather records, greenhouse gas emissions, terrain characteristics, or river flow measurements. The model then runs simulations based on mathematical relationships, generates predictions, and allows researchers to analyze results and make informed decisions. One important application is climate prediction modeling. These models divide Earth into a three-dimensional grid and simulate interactions among the atmosphere, oceans, ice, and land. By testing different greenhouse gas emission scenarios, scientists can project future temperature increases, rainfall patterns, drought risks, storms, and sea level rise. For example, higher emission scenarios generally predict greater warming by the end of the century. Another key application is flood forecasting. These models use rainfall, soil moisture, topography, and river level data to simulate water movement through watersheds. The outputs include river level forecasts and flood inundation maps, helping authorities issue early warnings, plan evacuations, and design flood control infrastructure. These computer models enable scientists to explore future scenarios that cannot be directly observed, making them essential tools for environmental management, climate adaptation, disaster preparedness, and sustainable decision-making. Statistical models are powerful tools used to analyze data, identify patterns, make predictions, and support decision-making under uncertainty. Statistical models help scientists understand relationships within environmental and social systems using real-world data. Statistical models can be descriptive, summarizing data through measures such as means and standard deviations, correlational, examining relationships between variables, probabilistic, estimating uncertainty, and predictive, forecasting future trends. For example, linear regression can be used to examine the relationship between carbon dioxide emissions and global temperature, while time series models help forecast population growth or rainfall patterns over time. Other important examples include normal distributions, which describe natural variation in measurements, and climate projection models, which use large datasets to estimate future temperature changes. Environmental scientists frequently use statistical models to study pollution levels, biodiversity loss, and climate change impacts. The key idea is that statistical models transform large amounts of environmental data into meaningful information, allowing scientists and policymakers to make evidence-based decisions for sustainability and resource management. Graphical models use diagrams, charts, maps, and plots to represent environmental data in a visual form. Graphical models are important because they help us identify patterns, compare information, and communicate complex ideas clearly. Different graphical models serve different purposes. Line graphs show changes over time, such as rising global temperatures. Bar charts compare quantities, for example rainfall in different regions. Pie charts display proportions, such as sources of carbon dioxide emissions. Scatter plots reveal relationships between variables, such as population density and resource consumption. Other graphical models include histograms, which show data distributions, maps that display spatial patterns like deforestation, concept maps that connect ideas such as sustainability, and flow diagrams that illustrate processes like the water cycle or wastewater treatment. The key aspect is that graphical models transform raw environmental data into meaningful visual information, helping scientists, policymakers, and students make informed decisions about environmental management and sustainability. Climate model, one of the most important computer models used in environmental systems. A climate model is a simplified representation of Earth's climate system that helps scientists understand climate processes and predict future changes. The process begins with input data, including temperature, atmospheric carbon dioxide, oceans, ice cover, and land conditions. The Earth is then divided into a three-dimensional grid, allowing interactions between the atmosphere, oceans, cryosphere, biosphere, and land surface to be represented mathematically. Computers run calculations under different scenarios, such as low or high greenhouse gas emissions. Model outputs include projections of global temperature rise, sea level increase, rainfall changes, Arctic sea ice decline, and extreme weather events. For example, higher co-emissions generally lead to greater warming and sea level rise. These models are essential for climate mitigation, adaptation planning, and evidence-based environmental policy, helping societies prepare for a more sustainable future. A population model is a mathematical model used to understand and predict how populations change over time. Population models help us analyze population dynamics and evaluate the effects of environmental factors on species survival. The process begins with collecting data on population size, birth rate, death rate, and environmental conditions. These variables are represented mathematically, often using the logistic growth model, where population growth is limited by the carrying capacity, K, of the environment. The model is then run under different scenarios to predict future population trends. Consider a deer population in a forest. If food, water, and habitat are abundant, the population grows rapidly. However, limiting factors such as food shortages, disease, predation, or lack of space reduce growth and eventually stabilize the population around the carrying capacity. The graphs demonstrate that a higher carrying capacity supports a larger stable population, while a higher growth rate results in faster population increase. Such models are valuable tools for wildlife conservation, sustainable resource management, and ecosystem planning. Projections of human population growth is an important application of population models. Population projections are predictive models that estimate how human populations may change in the future using data, assumptions, and mathematical calculations. The process begins by collecting information on population size, birth rates, death rates, migration patterns, and age structure. Scientists then select an appropriate model, such as exponential growth, logistic growth, or cohort component models, and make assumptions about future fertility, mortality, migration, and socioeconomic conditions. The model is run to generate population estimates under different scenarios. The graphs illustrate how exponential growth can increase rapidly, whereas logistic growth eventually levels off due to limiting factors. Different fertility scenarios produce very different future population sizes. For example, small changes in birth rates today can result in billions more or fewer people by the end of the century. These projections help governments plan for food, water, healthcare, education, and sustainable resource management while recognizing that projections are possibilities, not exact predictions. Let us now examine the epidemiological model, a model used to understand how diseases spread through populations and how interventions can reduce transmission. Epidemiological models demonstrate how interactions between humans, pathogens, and environmental conditions influence public health outcomes. The process begins with collecting data on disease cases, contact patterns, recovery rates, and population characteristics. Individuals are then grouped into compartments such as susceptible, infectious, and recovered, forming the well-known SIR model. Mathematical equations describe how people move between these categories over time, and computer simulations test different scenarios. The outputs predict infection rates, peak outbreaks, and the effectiveness of interventions. For example, without intervention, infections rise rapidly. Measures such as social distancing or vaccination reduce transmission, lower the infection peak, and prevent healthcare systems from becoming overwhelmed. This type of model became particularly important during the COVID-19 pandemic, helping governments plan public health responses, allocate resources, and reduce mortality. Interactions between components in systems is a fundamental concept in environmental systems modeling. A system consists of interconnected components that influence one another, and these interactions determine how the system functions and changes over time. In the example shown, sunlight provides energy to plants, plants provide food for animals, and animals return nutrients to the environment, creating interconnected relationships. These interactions can be positive, negative, mutual, or cyclical through feedback loops. A key concept is the feedback loop. In a positive feedback loop, change is amplified. For example, rising global temperatures melt ice, reducing Earth's albedo, which causes even more warming. In a negative feedback loop, change is stabilized. Human thermoregulation is a classic example. When body temperature rises, sweating increases, heat is lost, and temperature returns toward normal. Environmental systems such as climate systems, food webs, and ecosystems all depend on these interactions. Understanding them helps us explain system behavior, predict responses to disturbances, and make informed environmental management decisions. Role of interactions in environmental modeling. Environmental systems are not isolated, they consist of interconnected components such as the atmosphere, hydrosphere, lithosphere, biosphere, and anthroposphere that continuously exchange energy, matter, and information. These interactions drive system behavior and determine environmental outcomes. For example, plants in the biosphere absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, while oceans in the hydrosphere store and release carbon, influencing climate regulation. Environmental models represent these connections using conceptual diagrams, mathematical equations, computer simulations, feedback loops, and scenario analyses. Understanding interactions improves the accuracy of predictions and supports environmental management. For instance, water cycle models help predict floods and droughts, while climate models assess how greenhouse gas emissions affect global temperatures. By capturing relationships among system components, environmental models help scientists understand complex processes, anticipate future changes, and develop sustainable solutions for environmental challenges. Emergent properties. Emergent properties are new patterns or behaviors that arise from interactions among system components and cannot be understood by studying individual parts alone. A classic example is predator-prey oscillation. When prey populations, such as rabbits, increase, food becomes abundant and predator populations, such as lynx, also increase. As predator numbers rise, prey populations decline due to increased predation. With fewer prey available, predator populations then decrease because of limited food. Reduced predator pressure allows prey populations to recover, and the cycle repeats. The resulting population fluctuations are an emergent property of the system. Neither predators nor prey alone create these cycles, they emerge from their interaction. Understanding emergent properties helps explain ecosystem dynamics, biodiversity patterns, and how environmental systems respond to natural or human-induced changes. Next, Let us examine another emergent properties through the example of a trophic cascade. Consider a food chain involving wolves, elk, and willow plants. When wolf populations are high, elk numbers remain controlled, allowing willows to grow. If wolves decline due to hunting or habitat loss, elk populations increase and consume more vegetation. As willows decline, riverbanks become unstable, erosion increases, and habitats for birds, beavers, and fish are affected. This chain reaction spreads throughout the ecosystem. A real-world example is the Yellowstone wolf reintroduction in 1995. The return of wolves reduced elk pressure on vegetation, leading to healthier riverbanks, improved habitats, and increased biodiversity. This ecosystem-wide response is an emergent property known as a trophic cascade, demonstrating how interactions at one trophic level can influence an entire environmental system. Let us now understand the ESS examination pattern and the different types of questions you may encounter. The Section A contains short answer questions. These assess fundamental knowledge, including definitions, terminology, and identification of environmental concepts and models. The Section B contains structured questions require explanations, comparisons, and interpretation of environmental concepts. Section C includes data-based questions focus on analyzing graphs, tables, diagrams, and model outputs. Section D deals with application and analysis questions and students are required to apply ESS concepts to real-world environmental scenarios. Section E contains evaluation questions require critical thinking. Students evaluate strategies and justify decisions using evidence. Section F includes extended response or essay questions demand higher order skills such as synthesis, discussion, and evaluation of complex environmental issues and sustainability challenges. Section A, short answer questions. To assess your understanding of environmental models, answer the following short answer questions. These terms form the foundation for understanding how environmental systems function and change over time. Next, demonstrate your understanding of model use by explaining why environmental scientists use models, distinguishing between conceptual and mathematical models, identifying an advantage and limitation of physical models, and explaining why no model can perfectly represent reality. Finally, apply your knowledge by identifying the most appropriate model type for different situations, such as food webs, climate simulations, population graphs, volcano replicas, and population equations. Section B contains structured questions and requires more detailed explanations than short answer questions. In this section, you will apply environmental concepts, analyze models, interpret data, and explain relationships within systems. Answers should be developed using clear scientific terminology and, where appropriate, supported with examples. You may be asked to explain how different types of models represent environmental systems, evaluate their strengths and limitations, describe feedback loops, or analyze interactions between system components. Questions may also require interpretation of graphs, diagrams, or model outputs to draw valid conclusions. Section C focuses on data-based questions and assesses your ability to interpret, analyze, and evaluate environmental information. You may be provided with graphs, tables, maps, model outputs, or diagrams and asked to identify trends, describe patterns, explain relationships, and draw evidence-based conclusions. When answering these questions, always refer directly to the data provided. Look for increases, decreases, correlations, anomalies, and possible environmental explanations. You may also be required to evaluate the reliability of a model, discuss uncertainties, or predict future outcomes based on the data. In ESS, strong responses combine accurate data interpretation with relevant environmental knowledge. Therefore, support every conclusion with evidence from the dataset and explain how the observed patterns relate to environmental systems and processes. Section D assesses higher-order thinking skills through application and analysis questions. In this section, you are expected to apply environmental modeling concepts to real-world situations, analyze interactions within systems, and evaluate the implications of environmental change. Questions may require you to use models to predict outcomes, explain feedback mechanisms, assess emergent properties, or analyze how changes in one component of a system affect others. You may also be asked to compare different model types, evaluate their usefulness and limitations, and justify management decisions using evidence. To achieve high marks, go beyond simple description. Explain cause and effect relationships, use appropriate ESS terminology, support your arguments with examples, and demonstrate critical thinking. This section consists of evaluation questions and represents one of the highest levels of assessment in IB environmental systems and societies. These questions require you to critically assess environmental concepts, models, management strategies by considering both strengths and limitations. Unlike descriptive or analytical questions, evaluation questions require balanced judgment. High-scoring responses should present multiple perspectives, consider uncertainties and limitations, and support arguments with relevant environmental examples. To achieve top marks, structure your answer logically, provide evidence for each point, compare alternative viewpoints, and finish with a well-reasoned conclusion.